a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city, there was a big white house with tall windows and a small garden that always smelled like jasmine. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, a young maid walked through its gate carrying a small bag and wearing the same gentle smile she always did. Her name was Lena. She worked for a kind but busy family who hardly noticed much about her beyond her work. To them, she was just another house helper, quiet, respectful, and always on time. She cleaned the floors, washed the dishes, and made sure the rooms looked spotless before the children came home from school. No one ever asked her much about her life. No one really thought there was anything special to ask, but there was one thing that always caught her attention: the piano in the living room. It stood near the big window, covered in a white cloth to keep off the dust. Its black and white keys were hidden, but Lena always felt drawn to it. Every day as she dusted the shelves and arranged the flowers on the nearby table, her eyes would wander to that piano. She would stand there for a few seconds longer than necessary, staring at the spot where the cover met the keys. Then she would take a deep breath and turn away, reminding herself that it wasn't hers to touch. The lady of the house, Mrs. Howard, loved music but didn't play much anymore. She was often busy with guests and meetings, leaving the piano untouched for months. Lena always wanted to ask her if she could play it, even just once, but she never found the courage. She was afraid it would sound strange coming from her, a maid asking to touch such a beautiful instrument. Still, sometimes when she was alone and sweeping near the piano, she would lightly tap the side of it with her fingertips. She would imagine how it must feel to play again, to hear those sounds fill the air, to lose herself in the melody. But she always stopped herself. She would remind herself that her job was to clean, not to dream. Days went by in the same quiet rhythm. Lena worked hard, spoke little, and smiled politely when spoken to. But at night, when she went back to her small room in the servants' quarters, she would close her eyes and imagine herself sitting at that piano. She could almost feel the smoothness of the keys under her fingers. The memory felt both painful and comforting at the same time. One rainy evening, something unusual happened. The family had gone out for dinner and the house was completely silent. Lena had finished her work early and the rain outside made her feel strangely calm. She stood in the living room looking at the piano again. The sound of rain tapping the windows mixed with the faint ticking of the wall clock. She slowly walked closer. Her heart began to beat faster, like it was warning her not to do what she was about to do. But something stronger pulled her forward. Something she couldn't resist anymore. She reached out and gently lifted the white cover. The keys glowed faintly under the soft yellow light. She hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly. Then, with a quiet breath, she pressed one key. The sound was soft, almost shy, but it filled the room in a way nothing else ever had. She pressed another and another. Before she realized it, her hands were moving on their own. Her fingers remembered something her mind had long tried to forget. The notes came slowly at first, uneven, like someone trying to remember a forgotten language. But soon they began to flow smoothly and her heart followed them. Her eyes closed and she lost herself in the music. The rain outside blended with her melody, and for those few minutes Lena wasn't a maid anymore. She wasn't the girl who scrubbed floors or carried laundry. She was someone else, someone she used to be a long time ago. As she played, tears quietly slipped down her cheeks. The song she played wasn't one she had learned from any book. It was something her father used to hum when she was a little girl. She remembered sitting beside him on a small wooden stool as he played the piano in their old house. Back then, life was simple. They didn't have much, but they had music, and that felt like everything. But life had changed after her father passed away. Their small house had to be sold, and Lena had stopped playing. She promised herself she'd return to music one day, but life didn't wait for promises. She had to work, and survival left no room for dreams. The last note faded into the sound of rain. Lena wiped her tears quickly, afraid that someone might have seen her, even though the house was empty. She gently put the cover back on and stepped away from the piano. Her heart was racing, but for the first time in years she felt alive. Just as she was about to leave the room, she heard the sound of the front door opening. Her heart froze. Mrs. Howard had come back earlier than expected. Lena stood still, unsure what to do. She quickly grabbed her cleaning cloth and began dusting the shelves as if nothing had happened. But Mrs. Howard wasn't fooled. She looked at the piano and then at Lena. "Did you just play this?" she asked softly. Lena's hands froze. Her mind went blank. I'm sorry, ma'am, she whispered, her voice shaking. I shouldn't have touched it. I didn't mean to, but Mrs. Howard didn't sound angry. She walked closer to the piano and lifted the cover again. That was you playing, wasn't it? Lena couldn't meet her eyes. She nodded slowly, expecting to be scolded or even fired. But instead, Mrs. Howard sat down on the couch, her expression full of surprise. I've never heard anyone play that beautifully in this house, she said softly. Where did you learn? Lena looked up, unsure if she should answer. Her throat felt tight, but the truth slipped out before she could stop it. My father taught me when I was little, she said quietly. He was a music teacher. I used to play every day, until he passed away. Mrs. Howard's face softened. You have a gift, she said. Why did you stop? Lena smiled faintly, though her eyes were still wet. Because life doesn't wait for dreams, she whispered. Sometimes you have to let go of what you love so you can keep going. For a moment there was silence. The rain had stopped and only the sound of the clock filled the room. Mrs. Howard looked at Lena with a thoughtful expression. Not as a maid, but as someone she hadn't truly seen before. Tomorrow, she said finally. When you're done with your work, I want you to play for me again. Lena blinked in surprise. For you, ma'am? Yes, Mrs. Howard smiled. For me. And for yourself. Lena didn't know what to say. She just nodded quietly, her heart still trembling from everything that had happened. That night, when she went back to her small room, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her fingers still felt warm from the piano keys. For the first time in years, she felt that maybe, just maybe, her music wasn't lost after all. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But she knew one thing for sure. The piano had found her again, and through its keys it had reminded her who she really was. The next morning, Lena woke up earlier than usual. The memory of what had happened the night before played in her mind again and again. She still couldn't believe she had touched that piano, let alone played it. The soft sound of her own music still echoed in her ears. But more than that, Mrs. Howard's words kept repeating in her head. I want you to play for me again. Lena didn't know whether to feel happy or nervous. She had worked in many homes before, and no one had ever asked her to do anything beyond cleaning or cooking. To have her employer speak kindly to her about music felt strange, almost unreal, but it also filled her with a quiet excitement she hadn't felt in years. All day she worked carefully, making sure everything was perfect. She polished the floors until they shone and folded the laundry with care. Yet her mind was somewhere else. Every time she passed by the living room, her eyes drifted toward the piano. It sat there silently, as if waiting for her. In the evening, when the children were playing outside and the house was calm, Mrs. Howard entered the living room with a cup of tea. Lena, she said with a warm smile, if you're finished with your work, would you play something? Lena hesitated. Now, ma'am? Yes, Mrs. Howard said, sitting down. I've had a long day. I could use some music. Lena nodded slowly. Her hands trembled as she removed the white cloth from the piano. She sat down carefully, feeling her heart beating hard in her chest. For a moment, she just stared at the keys. Then she took a deep breath and began to play. This time she didn't hold back. The melody that came out was soft but full of emotion. It wasn't a song she had practiced. It was something her heart created in the moment. Her fingers moved with confidence and the sound filled every corner of the room. Mrs. Howard closed her eyes and listened quietly. There was something raw and pure in the way Lena played, something that couldn't be taught. It was as if every note carried a piece of her soul. When she finished, there was a long silence. That was beautiful, Mrs. Howard said softly. You have a gift, Lena, a real one. Lena smiled shyly. Thank you, ma'am. I haven't played in so long. I thought I had forgotten. Mrs. Howard leaned forward slightly. Did your father really teach you? Yes, Lena said, her voice growing softer. He was a music teacher. We had an old piano in our home. It wasn't fancy, but he used to say it had heart. He taught children in our neighborhood, and I always sat beside him watching. He used to say that every piano key holds a story, and when you play, you tell yours. Mrs. Howard listened carefully, not interrupting. Lena took a deep breath. After he passed away, everything changed. My mother got sick. We had to sell the piano. After that, I started working to help with money. I never touched another piano again. Mrs. Howard's eyes softened. That must have been hard, Lena nodded. Yes, but that's life. You don't always get to choose what to keep. You just learn to move on. There was silence between them for a while. Then Mrs. Howard said, "You shouldn't hide that talent. Music like that shouldn't be locked away. It deserves to be heard." Lena looked down at her hands. "Maybe once," she said quietly, "but not now. People don't expect music from someone like me." Mrs. Howard shook her head. "People expect too little sometimes." For the next few weeks, something changed in the house. Mrs. Howard would often ask Lena to play in the evenings. The children would sit quietly on the floor and listen. Even the other helpers in the house, who at first laughed about it behind her back, began to stop and listen when she played. The piano, once a silent piece of furniture, became the heart of the home again. But not everyone was happy about it. One of the older housekeepers, who had been working there for years, didn't like the attention Lena was getting. "She's a maid," she whispered to the others one afternoon. "Why is she sitting at the piano like she owns it?" Word spread quickly through the staff. Some thought it was inspiring. Others thought it was strange. Lena could feel the change in their eyes when they looked at her. Some smiled politely, but others gave her cold stares. She tried to ignore it and kept doing her work the same way. She didn't want trouble. But deep inside, she began to feel that maybe she had made a mistake by letting herself get too close to something that wasn't meant for her world. One afternoon, a guest came to visit, a man who was a close friend of Mrs. Howard. He was tall, with gentle eyes and a friendly smile. When he saw the piano, he asked, "Who plays this? It's been beautifully maintained." Mrs. Howard smiled proudly. "Our Lena does." "You should hear her. She's wonderful." The man looked surprised. "Your maid plays?" Mrs. Howard nodded. "Wait until you hear her." She called out for Lena, who came into the room with her hands still slightly damp from washing dishes. "Would you play something for us?" Mrs. Howard asked kindly. Lena hesitated, glancing at the guest. "Now?" "Yes," Mrs. Howard said. "Just one piece." Lena nodded and walked to the piano. She sat down, her heart beating fast. The guest watched with curiosity. She started playing a soft tune, one that carried a feeling of both sadness and hope. It wasn't fancy, but it had depth. Every note seemed to have meaning. When she finished, the man clapped his hands slowly. "That was extraordinary," he said. "You play with feeling, not just skill." "That's rare." Lena blushed and smiled politely. "Thank you, sir." After she left the room, the man turned to Mrs. Howard. "She's gifted," he said. "She should perform. I'm organizing a small charity event next month. Just local artists, students, a few professionals. Would she be willing to play there?" Mrs. Howard looked thoughtful. "I'll ask her," she said. That evening, she called Lena into the living room again. "How would you like to perform at a small charity event next month?" she asked. Lena froze. "Me perform?" "Yes," Mrs. Howard said with a smile. "It's a simple event. People would love to hear you play." Lena shook her head immediately. "No, ma'am. I can't. I'm not ready. I haven't played in years. And besides, people won't take me seriously." "I'm just—" "Don't say just," Mrs. Howard interrupted softly. "You're not just anything. You're someone who has a gift. And gifts are meant to be shared." Lena's heart raced. She didn't know what to say. The thought of standing in front of strangers, of being judged, terrified her. She had spent years blending into the background, and now someone wanted her to step into the light. "I'll think about it," she whispered finally. Mrs. Howard smiled gently. "That's all I ask." That night, Lena sat by her small window, staring at the city lights in the distance. She thought about her father, about the days when music was her whole world. She thought about the people who might look at her and see nothing more than a maid with a broom. But then she remembered the feeling she had when her fingers touched the keys. That moment when everything else disappeared. And she felt alive again. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Maybe it's time to stop hiding." Then she smiled softly, though a tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of hope. And deep down, she knew that her story with the piano was far from over. The next morning, the thought of performing in front of people still filled Lena with fear. She tried to convince herself that it was impossible, that she wasn't ready, that someone like her didn't belong on a stage. But no matter how much she tried to push it away, the idea stayed in her mind like a quiet whisper she couldn't ignore. Mrs. Howard didn't bring it up for a few days. She wanted Lena to think about it in her own time, but the guest who had invited her, the pianist who had heard her play, sent a formal invitation for the charity event. It would be held at the town hall in 3 weeks, with a mix of local artists and young students performing. The cause was noble, raising funds to buy instruments for children who couldn't afford them. When Lena saw the invitation, her hands began to tremble. She read the words again and again. Her name was written at the bottom in neat handwriting, "Performance by Lena Piano Solo." She couldn't believe it. It didn't feel real. She wanted to say no, to find a reason to step back, but something inside her wouldn't let her. It was as if a small voice kept saying, "You were born to do this." That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her father and how he used to tell her, "The world may forget you, but music never will." She wondered if he would be proud of her now. Over the next few days, whenever her chores were done, she practiced on the piano in the living room. At first, her hands felt stiff, and her fingers stumbled over the keys. But slowly, her rhythm returned. The sound that came out was full of feeling, shaped by years of pain, hope, and quiet endurance. The children often gathered around her when she played. They didn't talk. They just listened, wide-eyed, as if they could feel her emotions through the melody. Even the other helpers began to soften toward her. They might not understand her world, but they couldn't deny the beauty that came from her hands. One afternoon, Mrs. Howard walked into the room and watched her play silently. When Lena finished, she said, "You're getting better every day. Are you nervous?" Lena smiled weakly. "More than nervous, ma'am. I'm scared. What if I make a mistake? What if they laugh?" Mrs. Howard shook her head. "They won't laugh. When people hear truth in music, they listen. Just be yourself. That's all you need to do." Lena nodded slowly. She wanted to believe those words, but fear still clung to her heart. The day of the event came sooner than she expected. That morning she woke before sunrise. The air was cool, and her small room felt unusually quiet. She sat on her bed, holding her worn-out scarf, the only thing left from her father. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I'll try, Papa." Mrs. Howard had arranged for a simple dress for her to wear. It wasn't fancy, a soft pale blue fabric that suited her gentle personality. When Lena looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. For a moment she forgot she was a maid. She looked like someone who belonged beside a piano. When they reached the town hall, Lena's heart began to pound. The hall was grand, with golden lights, red curtains, and rows of chairs filled with people. Musicians moved around backstage, some tuning violins, others whispering nervously. Lena stood quietly near the corner, holding her trembling hands together. She had never been in a place like this. Her whole life had been spent cleaning places like these, not performing in them. The pianist who had invited her approached with a friendly smile. "Don't be afraid," he said softly. "Just play from your heart. That's what people will remember." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. When it was finally her turn, she walked onto the stage slowly. The light from above felt too bright, and for a moment she couldn't see the audience clearly. She could only hear the soft murmurs and the shuffling of feet. Her hands felt cold as she sat down on the piano bench. She closed her eyes. The noise around her faded away. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note came out shaky, almost hesitant. But as she continued, the sound grew stronger, clearer. The music began to tell her story, of a little girl who loved to play beside her father, of a home filled with laughter, of loss, of long days spent working quietly while dreams gathered dust. The melody rose and fell like a heartbeat. Every note carried emotion, pain, hope, and something unexplainably beautiful. The crowd, which had been chatting before, fell completely silent. Even the pianist who had invited her stood near the curtain, listening with tears in his eyes. Lena played as if the piano was speaking for her, saying everything she had never said aloud. Her hands moved with grace and certainty, and by the time she finished, her chest was rising and falling fast, her eyes wet with tears. There was a long, heavy silence. Then slowly, the hall filled with applause, soft at first, then louder and louder. People stood to their feet. Some were wiping their eyes. Lena didn't move for a moment. She couldn't believe what was happening. The sound of people clapping for her, felt like something out of a dream. She stood up slowly and bowed her head, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Thank you." When she stepped off the stage, the pianist took her hands and said, "You didn't just play music, Lena. You made people feel. That's the greatest gift an artist can give." She smiled shyly. "I didn't think anyone would listen." He shook his head. "They didn't just listen. They heard you." Later that night, Mrs. Howard hugged her warmly. "You did it," she said proudly. "I'm so happy for you." Lena smiled through her tears. "I was so scared, ma'am. My hands were shaking. But they didn't show it," Mrs. Howard said. "You played with courage." As they drove back home, Lena looked out the window. The city lights glowed softly against the night sky. She felt light, almost weightless, as if a heavy part of her heart had finally lifted. When they reached home, the piano in the living room looked different now. It didn't feel distant anymore. It felt like a friend. She sat down quietly and played one last song that night, something soft and full of gratitude. For the first time in her life, Lena didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel small or ordinary. She felt whole. The piano had reminded her that her dreams were still alive, waiting for her to believe in them again. And though she didn't know what would come next, she knew one thing for sure: her journey with music was just beginning. That night, as she closed her eyes, the sound of applause echoed softly in her mind. It wasn't just the sound of people clapping. It was the sound of her heart waking up after years of silence. The morning after the charity event, the sunlight felt warmer than usual. Lena woke up early, her mind still full of what had happened the night before. She had stood on a real stage, played before strangers, and heard their applause. It felt like a dream she never dared to dream. When she came to work that day, Mrs. Howard greeted her with a wide smile. "Everyone loved your performance," she said warmly. "You made people cry in the best way. Even the pianist who organized the event couldn't stop talking about you." Lena smiled shyly. "I still can't believe it happened, ma'am. I thought I would forget everything once I sat there. My hands were shaking so badly." Mrs. Howard laughed softly. "That's how you know it mattered to you. You played from your heart, not from your memory." For a moment, they both stood quietly in the living room. The piano looked different now, as if it carried the glow of everything that had happened. It wasn't just an instrument anymore, then it had become a part of her story. But not everyone saw it that way. The older housekeeper, who had always been a little jealous, started spreading quiet rumors. "She's getting too proud," she whispered to the cook one afternoon. "First she was cleaning floors, now she's performing on stage. Who does she think she is?" The words reached Lena eventually. She didn't respond to them, but they stayed in her heart like small thorns. She didn't want to be seen as proud or different. She only wanted to play, to share a piece of herself. But she knew that once people started seeing you in a new light, they never saw you the same way again. One evening, the pianist who had invited her came to the house to visit. Mrs. Howard welcomed him with tea and invited Lena to join them. "I've had so many people ask about you," he told her. "Some music schools are interested in meeting you. You have a natural gift and something rare." Lena was stunned. "Music schools?" she repeated, her voice full of disbelief. He nodded. "Yes, they'd love to hear you play. Maybe even help you get formal training again if you're willing." For a moment, Lena couldn't speak. The idea of going back to studying music, to learning, playing, living inside that world again, felt too big, too far. She had left school years ago to help her family survive. The idea of being a student again felt like another life. "I don't know if I can," she said softly. "It's been so long. I don't belong there anymore." The pianist smiled gently. "Music doesn't care where you come from. It only cares where your heart is." That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her heart torn between fear and hope. Part of her wanted to take that chance, but another part of her whispered that it was too late, that the world outside her small circle wasn't made for someone like her. The next few days passed quietly. She continued her work, playing the piano in the evenings when the house was calm. But she noticed that every time she played now, there was a small crowd outside the window, neighbors, children, and even strangers who had heard about the maid who played so beautifully. She didn't know how to feel about it. It made her nervous but also proud. For years she had blended into the background, invisible. Now people were stopping to listen. One evening, while she was playing, Mrs. Howard came in holding a small letter. "It's for you," she said. Lena wiped her hands and took the envelope. It was from the music academy in town. They had seen her performance and wanted to offer her a chance to attend evening classes for free. as part of their scholarship program. Her eyes widened. Free classes? Mrs. Howard smiled. Yes, I told you good things come when you least expect them. Tears filled Lena's eyes. She didn't know how to thank her. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. I've been out of school for so long. Mrs. Howard placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You can. You've already done the hardest part, believing again. The next week, Lena attended her first music class at the academy. She felt nervous walking through the big glass doors surrounded by students carrying books and instruments. She felt out of place wearing her simple clothes among people who seemed to belong. But when she sat in front of the piano, everything else faded away. Her fingers found their way to the keys, and her nerves melted into sound. The instructor watched her play with quiet amazement. You've got something special, he said. You don't play with technique alone, Wince, you play with truth. Lena smiled shyly. It's the only way I know. Weeks turned into months. Lena balanced her work at the house with her classes. Every evening after finishing her chores, she would rush to the academy and practice for hours. Sometimes she would return home late, her fingers sore but her heart full. The children in the house began asking her to teach them. Can you show me how to play like you? The little girl would ask. And Lena would laugh softly, showing her how to press each key, explaining that music wasn't about perfection. It was about feeling. The other staff members slowly changed their attitude too. They saw how hard she worked, how humble she remained despite everything. The older housekeeper who once mocked her now listened quietly from the kitchen whenever Lena played. But success didn't come without struggle. There were nights when Lena felt exhausted, torn between her duties and her dream. Sometimes she thought about quitting, going back to her simple, quiet life. But then she would remember the sound of the applause, the look of pride on Mrs. Howard's face, and the memory of her father's words. Never stop telling your story through the keys. Those memories kept her going. Months later, the academy held another event, this time a concert featuring its students. Lena was invited to play as part of the final act. It wasn't a charity event anymore. It was a true concert, where professional musicians would perform alongside rising students. When she stepped onto the stage that night, she wasn't the frightened maid who once hid her hands behind a broom. She was someone new, someone who had learned to face her fears. She played a piece she had written herself, one that told her story. It began softly, almost uncertain, like the first time she had touched the piano after years. Then it grew stronger, filled with warmth and hope, ending in a quiet, peaceful tone, a sound that felt like coming home. The audience stood up once more, clapping and cheering. And this time Lena didn't cry. She smiled, a deep, quiet smile, knowing that her father would have been proud. After the concert, one of the students asked her, "How did you learn to play like that?" Lena looked down at her hands and said softly, "I just listened to what my heart wanted to say." That night, when she returned home, she sat again at the old piano in Mrs. Howard's living room. The moonlight touched the keys and she played one last melody before going to bed, a song of peace, gratitude, and freedom. She knew then that her journey had changed her forever. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was the woman whose fingers told the truth, and through her music the world had finally heard who she really was. Lena's life slowly began to change after that second concert. Her name started appearing in small music articles, and people began calling her the maid who played like a poet. At first, she didn't know how to handle the attention. She had spent years in silence doing chores quietly, never expecting the world to look her way. Now suddenly, people wanted to hear her story. Mrs. Howard would sometimes show her the newspaper clippings. "You're becoming quite popular," she'd say with a smile. Lena would shake her head. "I'm not sure I deserve that. I just played what I felt." But Mrs. Howard would reply gently, "That's exactly why people love you. You remind them that beauty can come from anywhere, even from someone who cleans their floors." Those words stayed with Lena. She realized that her story wasn't just about music anymore. It was about proving that anyone could rise again, no matter where life had pushed them. One afternoon, she received an unexpected letter. It was from the city's music foundation. They were organizing a national talent event, and they wanted her to represent the academy. It was a huge opportunity, something that could open doors she never imagined. When she read the letter, her hands trembled. A national event? She whispered to herself. Me? That evening, she sat at the piano for hours, not playing but thinking. She remembered the small girl she once was, sitting beside her father, trying to reach the pedals. She remembered his words. One day, these keys will take you somewhere beautiful. Maybe this was what he meant all along. But with opportunity came doubt. Lena began to worry that she wasn't ready, that she didn't belong among trained musicians who had studied for years. There were nights when fear crept into her mind and made her question everything. During one of those nights, Mrs. Howard walked into the room quietly and saw Lena sitting at the piano, staring at the keys without playing. "You're scared," she said softly. Lena nodded. "What if I fail? What if everyone realizes I'm not as good as they think?" Mrs. Howard smiled kindly. "Then you fail with honesty. That's better than never trying at all. You've already won by being brave enough to play in a world that once ignored you." Those words gave Lena strength. She decided to go. The national event was held in a grand hall filled with bright lights and people from all over the country. Musicians carried their instruments like treasures. Some looked confident, others nervous. Lena stood among them in her simple dress, clutching a small notebook where she had written her piece, one she had composed in the quiet nights after work. When her turn came, she walked to the piano slowly. The hall was huge, and the silence felt heavier than any she had ever known. For a second, her heart almost gave up. But then she remembered the first night she played in Mrs. Howard's house, how music had saved her when words couldn't. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The melody started softly, like a whisper from the past, full of warmth, pain, and hope. It carried the story of a girl who lost everything but never gave up on her dream. As she played, her eyes closed and she forgot about the people watching. It was just her and the piano, speaking a language only they understood. When the last note faded, there was silence. Then slowly, the sound of applause filled the hall. It grew louder, echoing through the air until it felt like a wave. Lena looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. People were standing, clapping with genuine emotion. In the crowd, she saw Mrs. Howard smiling proudly, tears shining in her eyes. After the performance, one of the judges came to her backstage. "Your playing touched everyone," he said. "It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That's something you can't teach." Lena smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't win the competition that night, but she walked away with something greater, the realization that she didn't need trophies to prove her worth. Her story itself had become her victory. After that event, invitations began to come in from small music schools and local events. Lena performed not for fame, but to inspire others like her, people who had once given up on their dreams. She told them that music or any passion could survive even in the darkest corners of life. Months passed and her schedule became busier. But she never stopped working at the house. She told Mrs. Howard she didn't want to leave, and Mrs. Howard respected that. "This place will always be your home," she said. One evening, as Lena was returning from a small concert, she found a group of children waiting near the house gate. They held small notebooks and asked shyly, "Can you teach us to play like you?" She laughed softly. "You don't need to play like me. You need to play like yourselves." From that day on, every Sunday, Lena began teaching children from the neighborhood. She borrowed an old piano from the academy and placed it under the porch. The sound of laughter and simple tunes filled the street. Parents watched with smiles, proud that their children were learning from the woman who once swept their yards. Teaching gave Lena a new kind of joy. She saw herself in those children, innocent, curious, and full of dreams. Sometimes she would tell them stories about her journey, how she started with nothing but hope and a broken heart. And every time she finished a story, she would say, "Never let anyone tell you that your dream is too small." Years passed quietly. Lena became known not just as a talented pianist, but as a teacher who changed lives. She never let fame change her. She still lived simply, still helped around the house, still played with the same love she had on the very first day. One afternoon, the academy invited her to give a guest speech. When she stood on stage, she looked at the young faces before her, faces filled with ambition and nerves. "I used to think talent was everything," she said, "but I learned that courage is just as important. Sometimes life will bury your dreams deep under pain and responsibility, but if you keep a little piece of hope alive, One day it will grow again. Her words moved the audience to tears. That night, when she returned home, she sat again at the piano. The keys had grown slightly worn from years of playing, but they still felt like home under her fingers. She closed her eyes and began to play a soft melody, a tune full of peace, one that spoke of everything she had learned. Mrs. Howard stood quietly at the door, listening. When the song ended, she said softly, "You've come a long way, Lena." Lena smiled. "I couldn't have done it without your kindness." Mrs. Howard shook her head. "Kindness only opens the door. You're the one who walked through it." Outside, the evening air carried the faint sound of her music through the street. People passing by stopped for a moment to listen. To them, it was just a beautiful tune. But to Lena, it was her life. Every joy, every tear, every silent prayer woven into sound. She no longer played for recognition. She played because it was who she was. And in that quiet house, under the fading light, the maid who once hid her dreams behind a broom became the woman whose music reminded the world that miracles often come from the most ordinary places.